Of a webinar. This is number 2 of 3 of a webinar series that we're putting on around ecosystem services, verified impacts. The first episode was last week, and that kind of just was the overarching kind of why in the world are we doing this? Who cares? And so Wesley gave us a really nice basis for why this is important, who it's important to, and those kind of things, and what's kind of spurring this whole movement forward. And we do have a really top-notch person who's very experienced with the procedure, Wesley Snell with Etifor. He is based in Italy, in Padua, which is kind of north of Venice, if you know your geography in Italy at all. And but he's from the US, so we won't have to deal with the strong Italian accent, which, although charming, I know can be hard for folks sometimes. But he does have a North Carolina accent for anybody. So, no, I'm just kidding. But just want to welcome Wesley. He was on the Ecosystem Services Working Group that developed the new procedure that was just published in January. And he's been an integral part of it. He's been involved with ecosystem services and those types of programs around the world. And they have Etifor, the company he works for, is an ecosystem services biodiversity type corporation. That's what they do. And they've been using the procedure very successfully around the world. And he's agreed to sit with us for a couple of hours over these 3 weeks to introduce the procedure to you guys. He's coming to us from, like I said, from Italy. So he's coming to us at night, and we really appreciate that. He's 6 hours forward of Eastern time. So we really appreciate Wesley coming in and giving us part of his evening for 3 weeks in a row. And bless his wife for letting him do that. And I'm going to turn it over to Wesley now, and we can get started.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, no worries. And this was also pre-approved by the wife, so we're in the green here, no problem. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and hello everybody. I think we have a few people also from the last session who were here. So you may hear a little bit of overlap, but not too much, because today we're going to really dive into how to apply the procedure. And I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see the presentation? Let me bring up the presentation mode. All good? Legible? Everybody can read it? Okay, great. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to do a brief introduction. Those of you who were here last time, it'll be a bit of a repeat, but I'll move through it quickly. And then I'm going to give an overview of verified impact and the ecosystem service procedure. Just explain what it is for those who weren't here during the last call, and a little bit of context of how we've arrived in 2025 at version 2. And I'm going to spend most of the session today talking about how to apply the ecosystem services procedure. So I'm going to walk everybody through, what I like to think of as the 4 stages of applying the procedure. How to identify the business case for doing so, setting objectives, meeting the prerequisites and safeguards, the actual impact demonstration process, and then the benefits and claims that the procedure gives you access to. I'm also going to provide a couple of case studies like Tom's alluded to. I've been working with the procedure since 2019, I guess. And I do a lot of work. I'm a forester by background, but I do a lot of work in environmental resource valuation. And so I sort of work the technical side. So how to demonstrate an impact and measure it, incredibly demonstrate it, but also how to raise finance for it and access markets for ecosystem services. So I'm going to provide a couple of case studies of some work that we've been doing over the last few years. For those of you who were here in the first call, this is not going to be nearly as dense. It's going to be much more a presentation. It's going to be much more straightforward. And I hope that we have plenty of time at the end for a healthy Q&A. So I'll just dig in, just a little bit of an introduction. I work for Etifor. We are an environmental consulting spinoff of the University of Padua, which, like Tom said, is based in northeastern Italy. And we do a lot of work in project development and environmental resource valuation. We serve our certificate holders and other land managers, as well as lots of clients, both from the public and private sector, who are looking to put nature at the heart of their decision making and properly value the benefits and services that nature provides. Um, we cover really all of these aspects from end to end. So economic, environmental, and social benefits. We cover policy work, actual implementation, sort of shovels in the ground, as well as building investment funds and working more on the financial side of things. We do these projects all over. So you can see we have a pretty healthy portfolio spread all across the world. So we're very comfortable working in many, many different contexts. And as far as the procedures concerned, we have, let's see, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, um, and in Indonesia are areas where we have experience in applying the procedure and helping forest managers access markets for services, which really vary by geography and by the type of clients, but I'll talk more about that toward the end. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Like Tom said, this is the second episode of this mini series that we're providing on the FSC verified impact. So the first part was fundamentals, and it was really a general target audience. We covered a lot of material, and it really was to lay the groundwork for understanding what is the current framework for and justification for applying a ecosystem services approach to managing your forests. What are the motivations at a policy level, at an investment level, for paying for the benefits provided from ecosystems? So how are companies and governments managing nature-related financial risk? What are the global and regional policy responses? What are the sources of demand? What are private and public stakeholders asking for in regard to forest managers and how they're managing their land? What kind of data are they asking for? What sort of quality criteria are they applying to these data, et cetera? So if you weren't able to attend that, it was recorded and shared. I've also shared the presentation. I encourage you to check it out. Today is going to be much more straightforward, and it's really just going to cover the nuts and bolts of how to apply the procedure. So we're going to cover the 7 steps of the ecosystem service procedure, how to develop a theory of change, how to select outcome indicators, measure them, and report them. And then the last session, which is a week from today, same time, we'll be talking much more about claims and sponsorships. So this is really aimed more at sponsors, but also at certificate holders who are trying to understand the main demand drivers and the value propositions of verified impact claims. So without further ado, I'll get into it. So what is the ecosystem services procedure and what is verified impact? So the procedure is an impact demonstration framework that allows certificate holders to verify the positive impacts of their forest management on 7 types of ecosystem services. And the way that it works is it sets these quality and integrity thresholds with pretty specific reporting requirements for all the stakeholders involved in a market for ecosystem services and the credible third-party verification of those impacts. So these are certificate holders. So what they need to report and demonstrate in terms of the local context, certain prerequisites and safeguards, what is the theory of change? How do they measure it? How does it compare to a baseline value? What sort of improvements or conservation impacts can we see? As well as for sponsors around how claims can be used. And a lot of this is in response to a lot of recent upheavals in the ecosystem services markets and the let's say, the credible use of claims, as well as certification bodies. And all of this is in order to credibly demonstrate and then responsibly claim these positive impacts. What does the procedure produce? So if you follow it, what do you get? The procedure produces quantified, externally verified, and annually audited impact claims that allow forest managers to access markets for ecosystem services. And there are different types of products that facilitate payments for ecosystem services. One that I imagine most of you are more familiar with is credits. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end of this session about what is the difference between a verified impact claim and, say, a carbon credit. But we'll save that for the end. So how do we arrive to this session? The sort of impetus for doing this is that the ecosystem service procedure has recently undergone a really significant revision. It's been a 2-year process. Like Tom said, I was a part of that working group. And it was a long and winding path, but we've arrived on January 1st of this year with a published version of the second version of the ecosystem services procedure. But just so you're aware, it's really been a much longer story than that. This was born out of a 7-year pilot study that was funded by the Global Environment Facility. It was called the FORCES Project, Forest Certification for Ecosystem Services, along with FSC, to develop the procedure. There were pilots in Chile, Vietnam, Colombia, a couple of other countries. And what it produced after those 7 years was version 1, which was released in 2018. That is the version that we, Etifor, and myself have the most experience in actually applying, and the one that is currently still active. There's a transition phase for the next 6 months for the procedure to totally come online. And I just want to make it clear to everybody that it's still a work in progress. What has come out of this revision process is what we can call version 1 of version 2. Or part 1 of the revision of the ecosystem services procedure. And this was to make sure that we quickly boost up the quality and integrity criteria in the procedure in order for it to remain competitive with other standards. But there is a part 2 of the revision process, which is happening right now, which mainly has to do with how claims can be used, and especially around the use of claims for offsetting and neutralization purposes. So if you have companies that are looking to sponsor claims in order to make claims about climate neutrality or offsetting their biodiversity footprint or their water consumption, etc., the current version, this version 2 of the procedure, does not allow any offsetting claims, and FSC is exploring how we can responsibly integrate those kind of claim systems under the procedure. But to date, we've seen more than 70 certificate holders have applied the procedure, really all over the world. This map is a little bit out of date. I believe we just recently had the first validated impacts in the United States from Forest Carbon Works. I don't know if any of them are in this call right now, but congratulations to them. But you can see that it's really spread all over the place, with more than 5 million acres, which are currently verified for positive impacts on carbon and other ecosystem services. Now, the scope of verified impacts, so what falls under the procedure and what forest managers can third-party verify in terms of their positive impacts. Something to be very clear, the procedure does not verify any and all ecosystem services, right? So if you look at global typologies for ecosystem services, they are numerous and storied. I mean, there's more than 250 under the CSIS database, for example. The procedure does not cover any ecosystem service. It covers 7. which is biodiversity, carbon, water, soil, recreational services, cultural practices and values, and air quality. Cultural services and air quality are new under the procedure. So version 1 only had the first 5 that you see in this table here. And these 2 have been added, and also the number of verifiable impacts has also been increased from 20 to about 37. And what this means is that for each ecosystem service, there are categories of impacts which are verifiable. So for biodiversity, there's enhanced forest cover, impacts regarding species diversity, natural forest structure enhancement, and maintenance of rare, threatened, or endemic species. There's others as well. There's functional diversity and other examples, but there's 12 impacts total that you can verify for positive impacts on biodiversity generally. And same with the others. Carbon is mostly related to the type of activity, so either the maintenance or enhancement of carbon stocks through afforestation, reforestation, or through responsible forest management, or through conservation practices. Water services allow you to verify impacts for either water quality or water quantity, etc. So the important thing to understand is that the procedure is quite broad in what it allows you to verify impacts for. But there are delineations and there is a boundary. It doesn't allow for any ecosystem service. It allows for these 7 and within those particular impacts. Another thing that I think is really important to point out is that compared to, say, a carbon crediting scheme, all ecosystem services are co-equal under the procedure. So unlike, say, Gold Standard or Vera, where the objective is for you to verify impacts for carbon, and then you can optionally verify impacts for co-benefits like biodiversity or community benefits, any certificate holder can choose any of these impacts. And I think the choice of those depends on what is verifiable, what relates to your theory of change, which I'll talk more about in a second. And what do you think is the most marketable? And where do you think you can actually raise sponsorship or generate value for going through the verification process? So that's just a quick overview, and I'll dig into actually applying the procedure. So there's 7 steps to applying the ecosystem service procedure. But really, I like to categorize that into 3 main steps. So first is making sure that as a certificate holder, you meet certain prerequisites for applying the procedure, that certain safeguards are in place and explained, as well as explaining the condition of the ecosystem service, both past and present, in sort of a qualitative way. The second part is the actual impact demonstration process. And this is where you're developing a theory of change, selecting outcome indicators, measurement methodologies, actually doing the measurement and comparing results in more of a quantitative way in order to demonstrate the impact. And if all of those conditions are met and it's verified, then you have access to benefits and claims that allow you to access other markets for ecosystem services. But I get a lot of requests from forest managers for applying the procedure. And often we start sort of in a technical way. So what is the theory of change? What are you doing on the land? Which ecosystem services do you think are most feasible for verification? But really, if I'm working with a certificate holder, I like to take a step back. And I think the most important thing is from the very beginning, identifying what is the business case for applying the procedure and what are my objectives for how I'm managing my land and how I'm trying to value and receive benefits from my responsible management. And does the procedure add value to those objectives? And for me, the important thing is this, is always to remember that certification is not the same thing as impact. And I think we sometimes confuse those things. So the certification process doesn't necessarily generate the impact. A forest manager can be having incredible benefits for local biodiversity or water quality that are unverified. And the process of verification, which is pretty intense, and there are costs that are associated with it, it's really important to understand what is the added value of having a third-party verified and annually audited impact demonstration. And so normally I like to sit with a forest manager and I go through some key questions. So I tell them they should be asking themselves, so what is the objective for demonstrating it? How much will it cost to measure and verify? What kind of benefits does the forest manager expect to receive for verifying those positive impacts? And how does third-party verification add value? And a big part of this is identifying who are the potential buyers or sponsors. Where do you expect to receive value? If it's just, and what sort of quality are they asking for? So, for example, for a lot of philanthropic funding or B2C marketing, so business to consumer marketing or individual donations, the threshold for demonstrating a positive impact is usually quite low. They're not expecting very, very rigorous and very intense monitoring instruments and third-party verification, et cetera. They're often happy simply to take part in your story. But if you're talking about results-based payments from public funds or receiving finance from companies or investors, then typically they're going to ask for a lot more information. And in order to reduce the risk of their payments or sponsorships, they're going to ask for it to be third-party verified. So it's really important from the beginning to not get tangled up in the weeds about how am I going to measure this and what's the how much is it going to cost, et cetera, but who is my target audience for this? And how does the procedure add value for those stakeholders? Uh, but once you've identified all that, you've sort of done your cost benefit analysis and said, yes, I'd like to go through with it. Then you walk through the procedure and it's pretty straightforward. So first you describe the context and prerequisites that need to be met. So you describe your legal tenure to manage, use, and or receive payments for the service, your management objectives related to the service, its current and past condition, how areas within or outside the management unit may be impacting or be impacted by your management of this ecosystem service, who are the beneficiaries, and what is the benefit sharing process, and what are the main pressures and threats, both human and natural, that you're addressing through your management practices. And most of this information should already be identified with the FM certification, but it's about distilling it from the FM process and really drilling down on that specific ecosystem service. From there, you develop your theory of change. And the theory of change is really the heart of the ecosystem service procedure. It's a way for forest managers to sort of very simply and directly make a causal link between how they're managing their forest and specific management activities and long-term impacts on positive impacts, hopefully, on these ecosystem services. And the way the procedure requires you to develop that theory of change is to identify the activities. So what are you doing? Link those to short-term outputs. So how much of it did you do and when did you do it? What are the medium-term outcomes of these outputs? And then what is the long-term impact? And I can provide a couple of examples here, right? So say you are talking about how you're enhancing water quality. And what you did is you fenced the water bodies, let's say a lake or a river inside your management unit. The output would be how many feet or meters of fence did you construct along the water body? The outcome is that you're reducing the number of pathogen pathways into the water body, say from fencing out cattle. The way that you're measuring that is what is the pathogen concentration in the water And if you can show a maintenance or an improvement, then you show the actual verified impact. What's important here is that for each of these, identify what needs to be reported and how specific should you be. So outputs do need to be quite specific and quantified. So how much did you do and when and where? Outcomes are more general and high level. The indicators measure a change in the state of nature or the ecosystem service, where the impacts declare the positive impact. And here you can see an example from these are verified impacts in one of our certification smallholder groups that we work with, the Grupo Forestal y Sostenible de Etifor, GFSC. And here what we did is we tried to show very clearly which group members and which FMUs did these specific management activities take place. So we're trying to say these managers restored natural forest characteristics. In order to do that, they had a suite of activities. They were controlling weeds, so doing a lot of weeding and control of dominant herbaceous species, removing invasives, planting native species and undergrowth, specific interventions like thinning to incentivize understory and pioneer species regeneration, etc. With the main outcomes being that these complex multi-layer or uneven age forests are maintained or improved, and that negative impacts, say from invasive or dominant species, are minimized, right? This is the structure of a theory of change, and it's just a way to simply tell the story of what did you do and what impact did it have. Once you've told that story in a simple graphical way, then you need to measure it and identify how you're going to measure it. And in order to do that, you have to select your outcome indicators. Now, the procedure requires that indicators designate and justify a target state for the ecosystem service or the state of nature. So what is the appropriate maximum nitrate concentrations in the water? What is the minimum viable population for a particular species that you're verifying an impact for? You also need to justify that the indicators are relevant and that they're verifiable and that they allow for a comparison of results between a present value and a baseline in order to demonstrate that positive impact. And in a more practical way, when I'm working with forest managers, it's the key is trying to strike a balance between the scientific rigor and clarity and replicability that the procedure requires and what data is available already, feasible to obtain, and provides practical, actionable information for the forest manager. So it's responsive to their management, it's measurable on an annual basis, etc. And the procedure does give you a lot of flexibility in selecting the outcome indicator, which is both a blessing and a curse, right? On the one hand, it gives forest managers a lot of freedom to choose the indicators that are most appropriate for their context. And on the other hand, sometimes we can fall victim to analysis paralysis and the tyranny of choice, where there's too many options and it's hard to identify which ones are the most relevant. But once you've selected your outcome indicators, in parallel, you also need to identify how you're going to measure them. The procedure does not prescribe methodologies for impact demonstration. And this is another key distinction from, say, carbon crediting standards, where there's a very rigorous process for identifying which methodologies qualify. But the procedure allows the users to select the most appropriate method as long as it meets certain quality criteria. So again, it needs to be credible, replicable, and suitable for the local context. And that has to be justified and it'll be evaluated by CBs. Now, the procedure does come with guidance, and the guidance also has a lot of recommendations for widely accepted methodologies for each ecosystem service and impact. And methods that are derived, that are selected from the guidance, do not need to be justified. Right now, we have version 1 of the guidance, which is active and out. Guidance 2, the guidance for version 2 is under development with an expected release in Q2, so around June of this year. But what's really important is that when you're selecting the methodology and going through the verification process, you'll need to specify the calculation method and all of the steps, what are the sources of data, where are the sources of uncertainty, and you'll need to provide granular data per management unit, which is verifiable on the ground. What you see on the left here is a sort of schematic that we developed for our certification group on how we measure carbon stocks and changes in carbon stocks in our management units. And it's a way of sort of quickly summarizing that we have multiple methodologies, 3 methodologies, depending on how much of information is available on the ground. That works with either stem volume or the total tree volume derived from forest inventories, et cetera, and then how we actually go through the process of demonstrating changes in carbon stock. This is a schematic. It's just sort of a quick summary, but you can be sure that in the actual certification document, each of these steps is really clearly outlined, including all the sources of data. Now, once you've selected the outcome indicator and the methodology and you've measured it, all that's left is comparing those values in order to demonstrate the impact. Now, the procedure is fairly particular about how those comparison values need to be stated and demonstrated. If you look through the procedure in Annex B, for every impact under each ecosystem service, you can find a table like this. And what it does is it outlines the requirements for the type of indicator, that the type of outcome indicators that need to be included in the impact demonstration, some examples, which measurement is required. So normally it's the present value of that outcome indicator. What are the requirements for the baseline? So it could be at least one previous value, a reference value, a description of the natural forest condition, a description of the surrounding area, etc. But for each of those impacts, the baseline requirements are spelled out very clearly. And then what is the required result for each impact? And normally speaking, the required result is for maintenance that the condition is stable, whereas for enhancement impacts that the condition is improving, right? And I'd be happy to talk more about this if you have any other questions. Once you've done that, you have verified impacts and you have access to claims under the procedure. This was in the last presentation, and I'm going to talk about it in much more detail in the next presentation, which is about claims and sponsorships. But it's important to understand how verified impact claims can be used. And part of that depends on who is the beneficiary of the claim. So for forest managers, they can use claims to promote their forests and their forest products. They can work on labeling systems for, so FSC plus verified impacts for carbon, biodiversity, et cetera, to be able to clearly show your clients or your buyers or your end consumers the actual quantified, verified positive impacts on nature in the forest that you're managing. And these uses have different value propositions. So for forest managers, we've seen examples of added value premiums, procurement, long-term procurement agreements, access to new forms of capital or investment, access to new market segments, and results-based finance. Forest managers can also, as well as anybody in a forest product supply chain, intermediaries, processors, mills, end users, retailers, et cetera, can use the procedure for their natural capital accounting, for their sustainability due diligence processes, as well as any assessment, management, reporting, or disclosure of climate or nature-related impacts. So they can use the procedure to third-party verify that they are insetting and reducing their impacts in their supply chain, to provide Scope 3 impact data for climate disclosures, to access green and sustainability-linked bonds, etc. Sponsors can promote their financial sponsorship of the impact and attribute with certain conditions the impact to their financial sponsorship. They can use this for within or beyond value chain impacts in order to meet their climate or nature positive targets. The last example is a bit of a niche example, but I think we already see it in the States, is that for project developers or carbon credit buyers, the procedure can be used to link other verified impacts for other services like biodiversity, water, community benefits, cultural services, etc., in order to promote these impacts alongside environmental assets or credits that are verified under other standards like VADA or gold standard. And speaking of which, I thought it might be worth just briefly explaining the difference between verified impact claims and credits. And again, I'm going to explain this in more detail in the next session. But there are some really key differences, right? So carbon credits are environmental assets. It's something that you own, something that is fungible and tradable and bankable. It's something that once a buyer has bought a carbon credit from a forest manager, they own to some extent that carbon, and they can trade it forward or they can hold on to it, whatever they want. Claims, on the other hand, are much more simple. They're simply verified statements of impact. They are non-transferable. They cannot be banked. They are immediately retired once they're sponsored. And importantly, they have very short value chains and direct sponsorships. So we don't see, like we see in carbon crediting markets, where you have a lot of speculation and inflated costs due to secondary markets and trading. For the ecosystem service procedure and the sponsorship model, it's really simple and really direct. So maybe there's a broker or an intermediary, but generally speaking, it's a very direct connection between the sponsor of the ecosystem service and the forest manager who's producing it. And so again, these sponsors are supporting claims, unlike credits where they're buying environmental assets. And again, there's some methodological differences. The procedure requires a revenue sharing mechanism to show how revenue from sponsorships is distributed among all the key stakeholders related to the ecosystem service. So maybe it's the landowner and the land manager or the concession holder, local beneficiaries, local communities, etc. Credits, on the other hand, do not have this revenue sharing requirement. Claims are also verified impact, I should say. The FSC system is much more flexible in which methodologies that you can use. And the sponsorships are really there to reward management activities. So unlike carbon credits, where you say I'm buying X tons of CO2, typically the sponsorship is more about saying we are making financially viable these specific activities. So it could be patrolling, monitoring, fencing, enrichment planting, afforestation work, other conservation measures. And the sponsorships are there to either make financially viable or reward specific management activities. I'm going to quickly go through some case studies because I do want to leave time for questions. I've alluded to this a couple of times in the presentation. We have our own smallholder group, GFSC, which has about, I think it's 44 certificate holders, which are almost entirely smallholders in conservation forests. So we have more than 3,000 hectares verified all across Italy that are verified for carbon, biodiversity, water, soil, and recreational services. We have 13 verified impacts in total. And we've seen a lot of success applying the procedure across almost any forest type: large, small, public, private, productive, or conservation oriented. Because the transaction costs of applying the procedure are relatively low, it really enables a lot of access for different types of forest managers. Another example I wanted to draw attention to in terms of a financing model is our Bioclima initiative. So Bioclima is an innovative blended finance fund that was launched by the Lombardy region of Italy. Regions are roughly the equivalent of states in Italy, and Lombardy is where Milan is located. And the Lombardy region launched a co-financed fund explicitly with the aim of improving carbon and biodiversity values in 16 of their regional parks. And the finance is contingent on the verification of positive impacts using the FSC ecosystem service procedure. So here you can see a schematic, the idea being that the Lombardy region, through BioClima, set aside 3.5 million euros in regional funds, with the objective to raise an additional 1.5 million in co-financing from the private sector. This 5 million euro fund goes specifically to these specific projects. So mostly conservation, responsible forest management, thinning, some wetland restoration, lots of different actual activities across these 16 parks. But what's really important is that in order to receive the funds, the forest managers or the park managers needed to go through a verification process. And in this case, they used the ecosystem service procedure in order to verify those impacts and unlock the results-based finance from the fund. So we originally started with 5 million total, but we saw a lot of enthusiasm from the private sector. I think we're at about 7.3 million now. So we've seen a lot of success with this sort of financial model for raising funds for verified impacts. Sorry, my screen is frozen. But we're right at the end of the presentation. Let me stop sharing real quick. And let me go back. Sorry, thanks for your patience. We're right at the end. And it's just to say that, sort of in summary of how much success that we've seen from, and how much interest and demand that we've seen from sponsors. So like I said, we've helped forest managers all over the world. On the demand side, though, we've brought more than 200 sponsors, mostly private companies, and raised more than 10 million US dollars to support these managers using the ecosystem service procedure and verified impact. Most of these beneficiaries were SLIMPs and conservation oriented forests. And the figure on the right here is just to say that we have a lot of experience in raising this kind of finance. There was a study put out by WWF a couple of years ago on the procedure and who's receiving finance for it or sponsorships. And the table on the right is a list of all the sponsorships that were registered at the time. And what's circled in red there are the sponsorships that Etifor directly facilitated. And so you can see that we have experience doing this with lots of different certificate holders in Brazil and Vietnam and Italy, and working with many, many different companies for sponsoring different types of impacts. So we've seen a lot of success with that model. That's the end of the nuts and bolts. And just a reminder, we have one more session, which is going to focus on sponsorships and claims. And that is next week at the same time. So I hope to see you all there. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And I don't know if we have any questions in the chat, but I think we have a few minutes. And yeah, I welcome any questions you may have. Thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks, Wesley. That was a, a really nice, dense presentation, but not too dense. Last time I felt like it was a little bit too much, a little overwhelming. This is really more down in the nuts and bolts. We don't have any questions in the chat so far. My bad. I forgot to mention to people that if they have questions, they put them in the chat. But if you want to raise your hand, we'll go ahead and unmute yourself and we'll call on you. And you can ask your questions directly to Wesley. So does anybody have any questions? Okay. Don't see any questions in the chat. Let me check real quick though. All right.
I guess not. I guess that means it
No.
was perfectly clear. Or
Yeah.
so, or so confusing as to render everyone speechless.
I do want to recognize that we do have Laura St. Peter here from Forest Carbon Works, and just you know, promote again that, they are the first use case for the ecosystem services procedure with their FSC forest management group in the US. And it was they're doing afforestation, so it was uh, restoration of natural forest cover, I believe, is what um, their claim was, unless I got that wrong, Laura. But feel free, Laura, if you want to mention anything about your experience with the ecosystem services procedure, since we don't have any questions from the group. Sorry to put you on the spot, but
I know you just love putting me on the spot.
I do. You get used to it. I'll do it next week too if you're here.
Yeah, our experience has been great, and thank you, Wesley, for the in-depth nuts and bolts presentation. You did a great job explaining everything. It can definitely be overwhelming, but you did a really great job breaking it down. For us, kind of I mentioned before, we do have an afforestation project down in the Southeast United States that we've kind of designed certified to the gold standard requirements, and the FSC ecosystem services procedure just fit really nicely into that. So, a lot of the work that we did on the gold standard side was easily transferable to the FSC ecosystem services procedure impact. And as our project grows, we're excited to add more impacts, as our little baby trees grow, as we like to say internally. And yeah, definitely excited that there's more impacts to claim with this new procedure as well. So, and thank you for the shout out. Much appreciated.
Well, we gotta give you lots of shout outs. I mean, you guys did something really cool. You're first in North America. I mean, that's pretty cool. So we did have one question in the chat now. It says, this is for Wesley. What do sponsors receive for or from providing finance? So can you talk a little about what sponsors get? This is from Jake. Um,
Sure. So the mechanical answer, the literal answer is that uh, what they get from sponsoring claims, as long as it follows the process and it meets all the sort of sponsorship criteria and claim criteria, sponsors can register their sponsorship in the FSC database. Soon, the FSC is also releasing a registry that will very clearly and publicly show who sponsored which impacts and for how much. So that's literally what you get, right? Because it's not an environmental asset that's being traded. It's a claim that you're sponsoring. Now, what is the value of that sponsorship claim? It really depends on who the sponsor is. We're going to talk a lot more about this in the next session, and I don't want to be too vague or evasive in my answer, but the truth is that there are lots of different reasons that sponsors may want to show that they are sponsoring third-party verified positive impacts in responsibly managed forests. If it's a sponsor in, let's say, downstream of the forest manager, like let's say a large forest product retailer, they may want to be able to demonstrate that they're engaging with their supply chain in order to reduce their Scope 3 emissions and reach their voluntary or mandatory climate target. They may want to show that they are contributing to global goals in line with their sustainability framework. It may be a prerequisite for their financing systems. It could be that an investor requires this kind of third-party verification in order to release in order to pass a due diligence, or a public fund in order to release results-based finance. It's really quite complicated because there's no one market for ecosystem services, right? And this is why I said sort of from the very beginning that I think it's really important for certificate holders to identify who are the potential sponsors of these ecosystem services and what are they asking for and what do they need. So anyway, I hope that somewhat answered your question. happy to go into more detail if you have a follow-up. I see Jake has another question.
Yeah, he's got a follow-up. He says, is it fair to say that a carbon project developer in the US may engage in verified impacts as a means to increase the potential value of their project to buyers?
Yes, short answer is yes. I would say that is fair to say. And Laura, I hate to put you on the spot as well, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I think this was probably part of the motivation for y'all applying the procedure with your project. Is that correct?
Excuse me. Yes, it is. A lot of our credit buyers are very interested and appreciative that we have FSC certification on our afforested lands. So now we're excited to kind of be able to say that we have now verified impacts for biodiversity, because we do get a lot of biodiversity questions from them as well. And we are champions of FSC, and FSC is a very credible brand in the kind of forest space worldwide. So just having that credibility of saying that we actually have a third party verified impact for biodiversity, it does add a lot of kind of credibility and additional value to our carbon credits that we're ultimately selling.
Thanks, Laura. Laura, can I ask you just a quick question? Because I want to make a point, but I want to check it through you. Did you receive a signal from a particular buyer that they would appreciate or that it would add value for them to have biodiversity impacts or an FSC certification in your project? Was it something that you said, generally speaking, hopefully if we do this, it'll add value, or was it a conversation you had with a specific buyer? I don't know if you can go into, I'm not asking for too much detail.
Yeah, not with a specific buyer. There's just kind of general feedback that we receive from buyers is that they have a strong interest and put value on biodiversity impacts. So we didn't add this into our scope to meet the needs of a particular buyer, but it's more of just adding to our story and our value of having robust and high quality names behind our carbon credits and all of the certifications and verifications that we have for our project. So kind of answered your question.
No, it helps. No, it's clear. Thanks. Yeah, I think there's two approaches to this. One is uh, if you're keeping up with carbon markets, I think that there's a very clear signal toward uh, premiums and preference and access to buyers through high quality credits and high quality impact demonstration. And I think the procedures are a really good way to substantiate the quality of your project. But another way to do this, and it's one that I recommend to a lot of forest managers who are first starting out, is have the conversation directly with the buyers, right? So if for them there's an added value, it might be important to also say, can you help us identify exactly how much is that added value? And that tells us the feasibility of applying the procedure. So it can either happen at sort of a general market analysis level, but I really encourage people when they're setting out to speak directly with their potential stakeholders or sponsors to identify what their needs are, because the procedure really has enough flexibility to allow you to demonstrate a lot of impacts. But let's say the marginal utility of doing that really depends on what sort of market you're trying to access and what kind of demand you're trying to tap into. I see Jake with his thanks, no problem. And thanks, Laura, for getting up on the podium with me. Appreciate you.
Well, I just had a question, Wesley. Speaking of, finance, do you see this more and more, especially from a European context, if a bank is going to loan money to a group to do a specific type of project, that they're going to want some sort of verification of the effects of that project to loan the money, and that this procedure might be applicable depending on how it's applied and the rigor for those specific projects? Because that's kind of what I'm hearing from a few people that I've talked to in the US. They're kind of like, well, my investors they kind of want me to do something around this specific topic because I need it for this or that to meet a regulator either in Europe or even in other parts of the world also.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know of anybody who would have a loan denied because they hadn't applied the ecosystem service procedure. It's not quite that, but what I would say is that it can really shorten and expedite due diligence processes. It can make it much more easy for you to show to banks that have a certain thematic interest or a sustainability focus that you meet their minimum criteria for issuing a loan or an investment. Another thing that I really encourage forest managers to explore when they're looking for these types of finance, say different types of debt instruments, is looking to find banks that are working with innovative debt structures that allow you to, say, reduce the coupon on your loan if you meet certain carbon storage or removals targets in your land. There's a lot of really interesting work that's being done in green finance. And the procedure is a way to let's say meet those kind of reporting requirements and thresholds for accessing green finance.
Well, I just want to thank you so much. Oh, we do have one more question. From Mike Small he says, transaction costs are preventing small landowners, less than 5,000 acres, from getting much value from forest carbon markets. FSC certification also has relatively high transaction costs. What is the size of a project, a landowner, or where the transaction costs don't eat up all the profits for the landowners?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thanks, Mike. It's kind of a complicated answer. I feel like I've been very complicated in all of my answers. They're complicated topics. The additional cost of applying the ecosystem service procedure is not super significant compared to the cost of forest management certification. That's something that we see with the managers that we're working with. And it's also something that we supported FSC with a sort of a global study on the costs of applying the procedure a few years ago. Compared to FM, the additional costs of the procedure are typically pretty low. And when we're talking about transaction costs here, I really mean the auditing costs, right? Now, everything else that's cost related to the project typically has to do with, are you changing the way that you're managing your forest? Or how are you measuring it? And I think that there are lots of really low cost options for the actual measurement part. And in terms of justifying like a change in your management system to justify an impact, my response is simply this: I don't recommend that smallholders apply the procedure first and then hope that they get finance or sponsorship for it later. I really encourage them to work from the beginning with a sponsor who's looking to support a project or a specific impact in their area. And the sponsors are typically the ones who actually need the third-party verification. And normally, at least in the sort of projects that we facilitated, they're more than willing to cover the costs of the certification and verification. I wouldn't recommend that a less than 5-acre landowner strike out on their own and hope that they get money for it. I would really encourage them to start first with the sponsorship and then to the implementation and verification.
Well, thanks, Wesley. I know we're a couple minutes over and I really appreciate all the questions. Come back next week. We'll have more information. Keep the questions coming. You can email them to me. I think if you don't have my email address, it is t.kain@us.fsc.org, and I will drop it in the chat. And keep the questions coming. And if you're not able to attend next week, maybe we can at least get to your questions and be able to help you that way. I'll drop mine. And I want to thank Wesley for setting up, being willing to participate with us and give us some of his evening. And yeah, just look forward to next week and for 3 of 3. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Cool. Thanks for
Wesley.
having me,
Thank you, Tom.
Y'all take care.